Most people would have set that up first, but okay. We will mix that, and you guys are still seeing my slideshow, right? Yes, good, good, because I'm not. There it is. Okay. All right. Oops, go away, go away. Put on here. Okay, so I am Josh Chris. I'm the residential horticulture agent for Santa Rosa County. You may ask yourself, what exactly is a horticulture agent, or what is an extension agent, or what even is the extension service? So way back during the Civil War, the federal government decided that there was a dearth of knowledge in the country on engineering and on agriculture. To cure that, they created the land grant university system. Now there's land grant, there's sea grant, there's air grant. University of Florida is the land grant university for Florida, and we also do sea grant as well. Which, matter of fact, we just hired a new sea grant agent. He should be starting here before too long. The purpose of that is the purpose is threefold. First of all, we're supposed to teach because we're an educational institution. We're supposed to do research because we're an educational institution, and then we do extension. So what is extension? That is your resource as the county, as somebody as a citizen of Florida. I'm your resource to reach back to all the people that stare at flowers long enough to be named doctor. So if you have a question, if something's not working, if you don't understand why your plants keep dying, those kinds of things, you can come to me. I take all the research, so I take all the words like ANOVA and regression and p-value and n-value and all those kinds of things, and I turn that into don't water your lawn quite as much as you do. So that's my purpose in this world, is to take that research and bring it to you in very plain language. But today we're going to talk about vegetable gardening. As I said before, you can ignore the QR code on here. You guys registered through Zoom, and that's good enough. Oops. All right, so the purpose of this first slide is to basically tell you to not listen to anybody on YouTube that doesn't live basically down the street from you. When it comes to gardening, your climate, your soils, things of this nature are extremely important. We live in a very strange county in that down in Navarre, Gulf Breeze, in that area, we're actually in zone 9A. By the time you get up to J, which is in the north end of the county up by Alabama, you're actually in 8A. So that's a huge difference in winter temperatures from the south end of this county to the north end of this county. At the same time, the soils change almost completely. So down in Navarre and Gulf Breeze, again, you're looking at a lot of sand. And as we get up to J, the clay content of that soil is going to be much higher. You may notice that we do a lot of row cropping in this county. If you've been to the north end, you've seen a lot of row crop fields. You notice those don't really begin until about Allentown, which is a little bit north of us here in Milton. There's a reason for that, because your soils are changing that drastically from the south end to the north end of this county. So basically the whole point of this slide is don't pay attention to the people that you see on YouTube unless they are living in this county in Florida or somewhere here on the Panhandle and they can understand our local environment. Luckily for you, I exist so that I can teach you these things. You can listen to me. So we're going to go over a few things today. We're going to talk about where you should put your gardens, the type of soils, the things that are going on in your soil. We're going to talk about fertilizers, irrigation, some environmental factors, how to select different plants, and some different garden systems that you should use. And now that I'm looking at that, I put some of those in there backwards. We're going to talk some about those earlier than is on that list. So siding, make sure that you're putting your garden fairly close to your house. The reason you want to do that is because you're going to need to be going out there and looking at it about every day. If not every day, then about every other day. Make sure that the soil that's in it is well drained. Make sure that it's getting 6 hours of sun per day. Keep in mind that from winter to summer, where that sun is in the sky is going to change a little bit. So make sure, being as we can grow things year round, make sure that you're getting that 6 hours of sun in the winter and again in the summer. It's very important, otherwise you lose out. It's going to need to be near a water source. The reason for that, you need to irrigate. You don't need to irrigate probably nearly as much as you think you do, but you do need to irrigate. Consider your yard and consider the microclimates that might exist in your yard. So what do I mean when I say microclimates? Microclimates are basically ways of trapping heat in your particular environment. You may have noticed over this last winter that we had a big problem with that, a big issue with that. So you lose heat in two ways in your gardens. The first way is that it radiates up and out into the atmosphere. But if you have, say, a lot of canopy trees over the top of your garden or the top of your property, your particular property may stay a little bit warmer. That's one of the ways that when we say microclimates, that's one of the things we mean. It traps that heat in versus letting it escape into the atmosphere. The other way that we lose heat in our gardens is that we get those cold winds from up north that come through and they hit those plants and they hit them really hard and they freeze them out that way. If you have a windbreak in your yard, we would also refer to that as a microclimate. So a windbreak can be anything. If you have a string of Leyland cypress that's planted and facing the wind and it's blocking the wind, that's going to create a microclimate, which is again going to make it a little bit warmer in those particular areas of your yard or your garden. So make sure that you're just aware of those things. Make sure you're aware of what's going on in your property. To avoid some plants and disease, or sorry, not some plants, to avoid some pests and diseases, we're going to talk about a 3-year rotation plan. That's extremely important, particularly when it comes to tomatoes that you have put in the ground. We have some things in the soils here. We have some funguses that are native that there's nothing we can do about. There's no way we can get rid of them. We have some nematodes that are native here and there's nothing we can do to get rid of them that affect certain types of plants, particularly your tomatoes. You may have either had or know somebody that has a 5-foot tall tomato and they walked out the next day, and the day prior they had a beautiful plant. They walk out the next day and it's just dead and on the ground. That's most likely Phytophthora or a nematode issue that caused that. Phytophthora, you may have heard it called fire blight. It's the same thing. It's just a fungal disease. They're native in the soil. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding giving them food, which is why we rotate our crops for a 3-year cycle. We want to make sure that we're kind of starving those nematodes out and giving them a chance to die off. Keep in mind that that can cross over into the same family even. So again, back to tomatoes. We wouldn't rotate our crops between tomatoes and bell peppers because they're in that same Solanaceae family. And so we don't want to do that because those same critters will affect both of those plants because they're related. Keep in mind that in the summer here, we're going to get about 14 hours of light a day. That's sunlight. And then in the winter, we're going to get about 10 hours of light a day. The reason that's important is because light affects flowering. And that's that P to PR balance you see right there. That's a phytochrome to a red-loving phytochrome balance. So basically, the difference between night and, sorry about that, my light likes to do that. Basically, the difference between night and day is going to create a balance of those two chemicals in your plant tissue, which is going to dictate flowering. And so that becomes most prevalent in poinsettias. You may not realize that in poinsettias, right about Halloween, they need to put those in 14 hours of complete darkness a day. And by complete darkness, I mean the light that you plug in to make your kid not scared at night of the dark will throw that cycle off. If they don't do that for 14 hours of complete darkness, those plants will not change to that red color that they're known for by Christmas, and they will lose millions of dollars. It can be that important. It can also be unimportant. There are short day plants, long day plants, and day neutral plants. So just make sure that you know what you're planting and make sure they're going to get enough light, and keep in mind that that's going to change throughout the year. Our first freeze here in Santa Rosa County is going to be at the end of November. Keep in mind that's an average. That doesn't always hit that 21 to 30 November. Same thing with the average last freeze date. It says 1 to 10 March, which is an average. It's not unusual for us to freeze even into April. And Easter this year was even a little bit chilly. You may recall that recently happened. So grain of salt with all these things. But on average, those are the dates that you need to look at for cold protection and warm protection and things of that nature. So your garden system, it really doesn't matter how you want to plant your garden. These principles are going to be the same regardless. You can use raised beds. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with raised beds. This picture here on the left is just half barrels that somebody's cut out or bought that way. I'm not sure how they did it. Nothing wrong with either of those systems. There's nothing wrong with planting in the ground. You just need to make sure that you're keeping a lot of these principles in mind when you do that. On the right here, we have a hydroponic system. Hydroponics is a good system, but they tend to be a lot of work. It is something that you can do though, if that's something you're interested in. So, excuse me. And we could talk about that. That would be a separate endeavor than this class, but we can talk about hydroponics. It is a viable way of doing things. So before we ever plant anything, we need to talk about our soil. Soil is made up of 3 particles that are sand, silt, and clay, and they are sized in that order. Sand is the biggest, silt is the next biggest, and then clay is the smallest. Even in our native soil, our state soil, which you may not have realized we have a state soil. It's called miasma. It's almost completely sand, but all three of those particles are present in it, just that the silt and the clay are at a much lower level in those particular soils. Anything that's got a higher clay content is going to hold on to nutrients and water better, which again is why at the north end of the county where they get a little bit more clay in the soil is where all the agriculture happens. And that's the reasoning, is that the soils are just a little bit better for it. It also is going to, it says lawn in there on that garden. It's also going to provide a medium for the roots to grow in your garden. You may not realize this, but your soil has a name. In my property, because I live in Jay, I have Orangeburg and I have Red Bay soils. They're both very good agronomic soils. They're the second best in the country. The first best being in the Midwest, where you can take a light bulb out of a lamp, stick it in the ground and grow a new lamp, because the soils up there are just that good. But down here, we have to do some stuff to our soils, and we'll talk about that kind of thing here in a minute. You may not realize the reason that I know that I have Orangeburg and Red Bay is because all soils have a name. Soils have taxonomy, just like animals have taxonomy and just like plants have taxonomy. It's just a naming scheme for that particular organism. Your plants do, or your soils do have a name, and you can find those here on this web soil survey that's linked on this slide right here. If you don't happen to get a picture of this quick enough, then if you just email me then or call us, then we can get you that website. So as far as these pictures are concerned, this one here on the left is a soil map of all of Florida. Now we are, of course, way up here on the panhandle, way out here to the left and in the western end there. And you may notice that we really only have two main types of soil. Those are aerosols and ultisols is the name of them. And the ultisols are very good agronomic soils, which again, are going to be in the north half of the county, which is where all the agriculture happens. Down here, you're going to have very sandy, somewhat infertile soils. And that doesn't mean that you can't grow things in them. It just means that you need to account for that when you fertilize and when you water and things of that nature. But how do you know what texture your soil is? What you're going to do is you're going to take a mason jar, fill it about 1/3 of the way with your soil, wherever you want to put your garden or whatever your garden soil is. Fill it about 1/3 of the way. Take a ruler or a tape measure or something and measure the total amount of soil that's in there. Keep that number on a piece of paper right next to what you're doing. Go ahead and fill that jar up the rest of the way with water. Put a little squirt of dish soap in there. Screw the lid on and shake it up. Go ahead and set it down somewhere that's nice and level. Give it about a minute. After that first minute, your sand content is gonna settle out of that solution. After about 2 hours, the silt content of that solution should also settle out. Now you've got 2 of the 3 particles that you need to figure out what your soil type is, or what your soil texture is. What you're going to do is you're going to measure how much sand is in there with that same ruler that you measured the total soil with. Measure how much of that is sand. You can take those 2 numbers and create a percentage out of it. Same thing with the silt. Now you may notice on this triangle right here, the numbers on either side, there's a silt side, a clay side, and a sand side. Those numbers equate to those percentages. So all you do is take the number from whatever percentage you happen to have. Let's say you had 40% sand, and let's say you had 40% silt. If you follow those to where those 2 lines intersect, you're going to see that you have a loamy soil. Now you're going to hear people talk about loam. All that loam means is that you have a roughly equivalent percentage of 2 different types of those particles that are in your soil. That's all it really means. And so you have different types of loams, and they're pretty good for agriculture and for growing stuff. But loam, all that means is a roughly equivalent percentage. But that's how you can tell your soil texture. The reason that's important is it's going to kind of dictate how well it retains water, how well it retains nutrients, things of that nature. So because we have 3 different particles in our soils, and because they're all 3 different sizes, I want you to imagine taking a big clear cylinder and we throw some basketballs in there and we call that sand. And then we throw some baseballs in there and we call that silt. And then we throw some ping pong balls in there and we call that clay, and we shake it up. You're going to have some type of percentage of that, but all of that is not going to be a solid substance. It's going to have a whole bunch of air spaces in it, which we refer to in soil science as pore space. What's in that pore space? What's in those little openings? You're going to have about 45% of that's going to be minerals, 25% is going to be water, and 25% is going to be air. And it says on this little pie chart down here that 5% is organic matter, but we live in Florida, so take that with a grain of salt. We don't really have high organic matter soils here. And this is going to be the impetus for putting compost in our gardens, which we're going to talk about in a minute. It's just a phenomenon that we have. On that front, actually, people always talk about, well, I brought in truckloads of compost and I mixed it into my gardens and I did this and I did that. Keep in mind that 1 acre of soil down to 1 foot is roughly 4.4 million pounds of soil. So you could add a lot of truckloads of compost to that and not change the overall soils of your yard. So don't be too shy with putting compost in, except for the fertilizer factor that you get from it, which we'll talk about in a minute. If you were able to take that same thing that you just threw all those different balls in and shove it straight down into the ground and then pull it right back up, you're probably going to see something similar to what's going on over here on this left side picture. Those are the different layers of soil. Everybody has those different layers. There are different percentages of that actual column, but everybody's got those layers. On the very top is going to be our organic matter, which again in Florida may very well be a low percentage. It may be very thin. If you were in the Midwest, almost probably the top 1 or 2 foot of your soil is going to be dark black organic matter. And that's just a byproduct of the grasslands that those developed on. As far as vegetable gardening is concerned, we're really only concerned with this O layer, this A layer, and a little bit of the B layer. And we're concerned about those because that's where your roots are going to grow. So when we go to amend soils, that's the area we want to get, which is going to be down to about 1 foot or so here. We don't really need to be digging super deep and trying to amend things super deep because the roots are just not reaching there and there's no point in doing it. So as far as organic matter is concerned, there's a lot of really good physical benefits to the soil from organic matter, water retention being one of them, nutrient retention being one of them. It creates a lot more of that pore space, which lets your roots get a little bit more air. If you didn't know this, your roots need air to live. That's one of the reasons why overwatering your plants kills them, is because you're actually physically drowning them. Your roots need air, just the same way they need fertilizer, just the same way they need minerals. I do want you to think of organic matter or compost as a fertilizer. It does have a nutritive load to it. It's going to be a very low-end fertilizer. You certainly would not only use compost as a fertilizer. I just want you to understand that it has a nutritive load inherent. I hate this one. It has a nutritive load inherent in it. There's a couple of different flavors of manures. The first one is animal manures. You need to understand it's not always going to have all the nutrients that you need. So while I do want you to think of it as a fertilizer, I want you to understand that it's not going to be a complete fertilizer. You're going to want to make sure that all animal manures are completely composted, because otherwise, particularly chicken manure, you may throw it on your garden thinking you're doing right by your gardens, and it's going to overdrive the nutritive load. I'm sorry, not the nitrogen, the nitrogen load for your plants, and it's actually going to wind up killing your plants. So make sure that it is always composted. And there's all manner of sources for animal manures. There is cow, chicken, duck, rabbit, all kinds of things. And I want you to understand that there is also people manure. The ECUA Bloom compost is an extremely good compost, but it's made from people. It's made from sewage mixed with leaf matter and things of that nature to get composted down. It is completely safe. There's nothing wrong with it. It's actually an extremely good compost. You just have to be comfortable with the fact that it comes from people. Any manures that you use, make sure that you put them down 90 days before you harvest anything out of that garden. Now, I don't think that by using manures, you're actually at any risk of anything. This is really just out of an abundance of safety that we say this, because I don't want you to have something that maybe didn't quite compost all the way, and then you use it and you get sick. So literally just out of an abundance of safety, if you're buying your compost from somewhere that is safe, shouldn't be an issue. And also most of the vegetables that you would put in this garden are going to take you 100 days to get any kind of fruit out of them anyway. So it shouldn't be an issue. There are plant sources of nitrogen as well. They, again, are not always going to be a complete fertilizer. So you're going to want to make sure that you understand there's a nutritive load there, but it might not be a completely nutritive load. So using compost does not negate using fertilizers. You can up these types of compost a little bit by vermicomposting, which is basically you just adding worms to that compost to give it another level. You may notice that at Home Depot and Lowe's and all those, they actually sell the stuff with worm castings in it for a little bit more. That's essentially what you would be doing with vermicomposting. You'll get a bunch of people that'll tell you that there's specialty worms that you need to buy for that, and it's these red wrigglers that are $30 a pound. If you just go to the local bait shop and buy a couple of cups of worms and then throw it into your compost, you'll be fine. Chances are, if you're composting, you're going to draw the worms in anyway, and those are not going to be those red wrigglers. So just go ahead and throw some normal fishing worms in there. You can use cover crops, which is what is going on over here with this crimson clover. I do want you to understand, though, that you should not let that plant get to that level. Those plants should never flower if you're using them for cover crops. The reason for that being, as they move into reproductive growth, which is what happens when your plants are flowering, it is taking all of the nutrients that are inherent in that plant and redirecting it all to those seeds to create seed. It's redirecting it all to those flowers to create seed. So you don't want to let your cover crops get to this flowering stage quite like this. Go ahead and kill them before they get there. You can either spray if that's in your moral liking to do, or you can cover them with cardboard or cover them with something and go ahead and kill them that way and then get them tilled into your soil. So how do we know what to plant and when to plant it? I don't like to tell people what plants they should and should not put in their gardens based on anything other than what month we're in. And I'm not going to dictate to you, and I'm not going to say that these do well and these don't do well. Plant whatever your family is going to eat. There is no point in planting peas if you have children that don't eat peas. There's just no point in doing it. This Florida Fresh is a great resource for that. You can go ahead and click on that. It's an app too, I believe. And it will tell you by month based on your zip code what's growing. So right now is going to be peas, beans, squash, tomatoes, peppers, stuff like that is what's going to grow this time of year. That's a great resource for telling you. You can also go onto Google and type in North Florida Gardening Calendar and then the letters IFAS. That's going to be very specific to North Florida, and it's going to give you a little bit more information because it's going to talk about ornamentals as well. It's going to talk to you about what bedding plants are working right now, what bulbs are working right now, what vegetables are working right now, what herbs are working right now, and then it'll give you a couple of maintenance tips for your garden as well. Those are both very good resources for dictating what plants you'd like to use. Now, as far as actually planting, there's two methods for doing it. You can either plant by seed or you can plant by transplant. Transplant is, of course, going to be the little plants that you buy from Manning's or Lowe's or Home Depot that are in the little cups that are about that tall. Those are transplants. For those, just make sure that you don't plant them too deep. Make sure that you space them out according to the adult size of the plant. So the biggest size of the plant is how you want to space those. It should say it right on there. Make sure that you're keeping the spacing for those. As far as seeds go, you're really going to want to create a furrow type system, which is what's going on in the picture right here. The reason you want to do that is because seeds need a consistent depth. If you plant your seeds too deep, they won't get the light that they need and they will never germinate. So make sure that you read the packet. It's going to tell you plant it at 1/4 inch deep or plant it at 1/3 of an inch deep or however deep it tells you to plant it. The furrow system, if you use a ruler to make these furrow systems, will just make you have a consistent depth for those seeds. Go ahead and cover them back over after you've planted them and keep that area moist until you start to see true leaves. And what I mean by true leaves, when you plant a seed, and you may have seen this before, when you plant a seed, it's going to start to get a little piece that sticks out. It's called a radicle. That's the beginning of the root system for that plant. On top of that, let's say this is your seed and that's your radicle. On top of that, something's going to begin to come out the top, and that's going to be those little seedlings that you see in your garden. It's going to pop up and there will be 2 little leaves on there. Those are called cotyledons. Cotyledons' sole purpose in life is to make enough photosynthase for that seed to begin producing real growth. So after you see those 2 cotyledons, another little shoot will start to come up from between them, and it'll start to put on true leaves that look like the leaves for the adult plant that you put there. So if you put a tomato there, they'll begin to look like tomato leaves, or they'll begin to look like squash leaves, or whatever you planted. At that point, you know that that plant's probably going to be okay, and you can back off the watering and keep it moist, but don't keep it wet. versus with the seed level, you want to keep it wet because they need water to actually germinate. Once they've germinated, once they're growing, go ahead and back off on the watering a little bit. So how do we know how long it's going to take our plants to grow, and how do we know how much seed to buy? A couple of things that you want to see. Johnny Seeds is a good company. If you can get somebody that has harvested seed from your state, so Florida specifically, then the adult plants, or the ones they harvested from, are going to be adapted to our area already. So make sure that you know the source of your seeds. But on those seed packet, there should be a couple of things. This top arrow here is pointing to, says days 45. That means from the time you put that seed in the ground to the time you're eating your first vegetable will be 45 days. Roughly. Now everything's an average, so keep that with a grain of salt, but it should say about 45 days so you start to eat vegetables out of that. The other thing you want to look for is that germination rate. Now on squash, it's 99% because squash just grows. I'm pretty sure that you could, yeah, squash just grows. And so 99% is what it's going to do. A lot of your corns and things of that nature, that percentage is going to be down on the 70. But if you look at that percentage rate of how much is going to germinate, then you can figure that out how much you want to, depending on how much you want to plant. Then you know you might need to buy a little bit more seed for corn because it's only 75% of it's going to sprout, versus squash, you know, you can buy a little bit less because the majority of it's going to sprout. So those are two very important things that you want to keep in mind on there. If you're buying your seeds and you're not going to use them right away, go ahead and put them in the freezer or the fridge. You want to keep them cool and you want to keep them dry. That's going to just sort of put them into dormancy, and then you can plant them out in a week or 2 or 3, whenever you get to it. Now, fertilization. Fertilization is something that's very often misunderstood. The very first thing that we want to know when we're talking about fertilization is what the pH of our soil is. So why are we so concerned with pH? Well, if you look at this chart, you can see all those green areas that you see on there mean that that element is available to those plants. There's only one type of tissue on a plant that can absorb nutrients and can absorb water, and that's the roots. So your soil pHs at these different levels are going to dictate the availability of nutrients for that. Now, for vegetable gardening, we very often say you want to be somewhere between 5.8 and 6.2. And you'll notice that nitrogen is very available at that rate. Phosphorus is not necessarily available, but you don't need a lot of phosphorus for most vegetables, so that's okay. Potassium will be available, and a lot of your micronutrients will be available as well. That's why pH is so important. Now, you can adjust your pH. Calcium, you may hear people talk about liming their soil. You may hear them using a sulfate to change their pH. pH is something that is changeable. You just need to know what your pH is to begin with. Now, if you bring us a soil sample here to the extension office, we can tell you what your pH is for free. And that's a free service. We only need about 2 cups of your soil. Take 10 different sites in your garden, take a garden trowel, dig down about 4 inches, throw all that into one bucket, bring us about 2 cups of it, just in a Ziploc bag is fine. And we can test that for you for pH, but pH is all we can give you. We can't give you liming rates, and we can't tell you what nutrients are in there. We can facilitate sending that off to a lab down at University of Florida to figure those kinds of things out, though. But we shouldn't need to do that unless your pH is way off. I like this slide because it just really hammers home the importance for soil tests. Let's say you're the guy here on the right or the girl here on the right, and you think, I fertilized, my dad fertilized, his dad fertilized. It's just what you do. I know that it needs it, and I'm going to go ahead and throw it down. Well, if you had done a soil test, you'd realize that all of the nutrients that are in your soil already are so high that you didn't need to fertilize. So in the instance for this person on the right here, they might as well have ground up their money and thrown it on the ground because they're doing the same thing. Conversely, the person on the left with the very low rates, if they said, well, you put plants in the ground and they just grow, it's what they do, I don't need to test for anything. Well, with nutrient levels that low, you're really not going to get a very good harvest. So the whole point of this slide is to just really hammer home why soil testing is important. You cannot just look at your soil and know what's in it. Now, there are ways to do that, but it involves a lot of very expensive equipment and drones and cameras and processing equipment. And yeah, so if you have $50,000 just to figure out what's going on in your soil, you can do that. But a test is $10. You send it off to UF, you get it back, and it tells you everything. So just go that route. I need to hammer home that fertilizer is not plant food. Plants produce their own food. They are autotrophs. That's just what they do. They use air and sunlight and water to create photosynthase. We've all learned about that way back in middle school. It's just photosynthesis is what creates plant food. Nutrients, which is fertilizers, are the things that are in the soil that help that plant build tissue. And so it's going to use the photosynthesis, to grab those nutrients, pull them in, and build tissue out of it. So, but just keep in mind that fertilizers are not plant food. Larry over there in the other office will yell at me if I don't tell you that. There are certain requirements, and whatever nutrient happens to be the lowest is probably what is limiting your plant growth. So if you look at this bucket picture here, it's really just an illustration of whichever one of those slats of that bucket is lowest. If you can imagine each of those slats being the nutrients that your plant needs, whichever one is the lowest is probably what's limiting your growth. Now, most often that's going to be nitrogen, which is why whenever anybody talks to you, they're going to give you fertilization rates based on nitrogen. That's just the reason we do it, because it is the one that's most likely not present in your soil, which we're going to go over right now. So all fertilizers are cations or anions for the most part. Nitrogen is not, and that's why it flows through the soil so easily. A cation is nothing more that way down at the atomic level is a positively charged ion or positively charged particle. That's things like calcium, magnesium, potassium. NH4 is an ammonium, which is a type of nitrogen, and then iron is Fe. If you have what we call a higher cation exchange capacity in your soils, which you get from adding compost to your soil, which is one of the reasons to amend soil with compost, it will hold on to those nutrients much, much better than a lot of your native soils and a lot of your sands. And so that's one of the reasons to go ahead and amend with compost. On the other end of that spectrum, we have anions, which are negatively charged ions. These are going to be things like chlorine, but it's okay that chlorine passes through your soil because you don't need a lot of that for your plants anyway, and there's a good chance that they're going to get it from whatever irrigation water you put on. It also repels OH minus, which, if you know anything about pH, OH negative is the compound that makes your pH more alkaline. So the fact that adding compost to your soils rejects that ion means that you are going to stabilize your soil pH at about 6, somewhere in the 6 range, which again is another great reason to add compost to your soil. What you need to know about nitrogen is that nitrogen is neither a cation or an anion. Nitrogen moves through your soil through water movement. So the more you irrigate, let's say you put down your fertilizer and then you turn your irrigation on and it runs for the next hour, you're going to wash that nitrogen down through that soil because it moves through what we call mass flow, which is just water flow through your soil. The reason I'm telling you that is because you need to time your nitrogen applications with irrigation. You do not want to irrigate too much when you fertilize, but you do want to irrigate a little bit because you want to get it down into the root zone of those plants. Remember, the roots are the only tissue that can uptake nutrients and can uptake water. Phosphorus is not going to act as a cation. Well, it will act as a cation, which means it'll get held in the soil. It's not technically a cation, but it acts like one. In Florida soils, we don't typically need a lot of phosphorus because it's a rock, and one of the biggest mines for phosphorus in the world is in Florida. So we tend to have a little bit higher phosphorus content in our soils to begin with. Really important when it comes to things like lawns, because there's a reason that we don't ever hardly recommend you get phosphorus for your lawn, because you just generally don't need it. Again, soil test to figure out what's in your lawn before you come up with a fertilizer regime. Cation exchange capacity, again, is just your soil's ability to retain water. The takeaway from this whole slide is that adding compost to your soils and mixing them in is going to pretty much universally be a good thing. Now, when you go to the store and you buy fertilizers, the first thing you need to do is check to make sure that there are some micronutrients in that bag. It's something that gets added afterwards generally, and if it's in the bag, then you just don't need to worry about it. They're micronutrients for a reason. You don't need a lot of it. You just need some of it. So just make sure it's there. The 3 numbers that come on your bag. Those are nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in that order every single time. The only one of those that's a true number on this particular bag is going to be that 16. And what that 16 is referring to is by weight, the amount of weight that's in that bag, 16% of that bag is some sort of nitrogen source, is what that's saying. Those are all percentages. So by weight, 16% of that particular bag is, okay, just make sure, is nitrogen, whatever the nitrogen source is for that bag, whether it's urea or whatever. The other two are a little bit misleading because they are a compound. So the phosphorus, for instance, that 4 number in the middle is a compound of P2O5. And so only, I believe it's 44% of that one is going to be actually phosphorus. And so 44% of that 4% is actually phosphorus. The same thing with the potassium, but I believe that one's 33%. So only 33% of that 8% is going to be an actual potassium source. I may have those backwards, but so you can always call us and you can always check with us and you can say, hey, the guy on the webinar told me that these are not true numbers and I just want to know what they are and we'll help you work through it. Point of that you need to know is that the phosphorus and the potassium that are in that bag are not going to necessarily be at the levels that you think they are. Irrigation is by far the fastest way to kill any plant, let alone vegetable gardens. It's also the fastest way to kill your lawns. Irrigation is nothing more than a balance of evapotranspiration and soil moisture retention, and also the additions of water that we put in, be it rain like we had today, or if it's just your irrigation. What we mean by evapotranspiration, it's a combination of evaporation because there's air in your soil and it's going to evaporate water as well. And transpiration is actually the water getting transported through the plant. So through the roots, all the way up through the top, and then coming out of the stomata on the leaves. It's called the soil plant atmosphere continuum, and it's just a hydrologic cycle that happens in your plants. It's the reason that if you're ever in the Midwest and you're standing next to a cornfield and it feels really humid and you go, I'm not anywhere near any large body of water. Why is it so humid right here? It's because that corn is pulling so much water up out of the ground and putting it into the atmosphere that it's creating humidity. That's why that happens. I've recently learned that this number is actually 60%, not 50% of household water is thought to be used for outdoors. So that's watering your lawns, watering your gardens, washing your car, things of that nature. So the more that we can limit that, particularly with water being a precious resource here in Florida, the better we understand irrigation, we can use a little bit less water per household, which means a little bit per household makes a lot statewide. That's the reason I'm telling you that. Sandy soil does drain water a lot quicker than your clay-based soils, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't hold on to any water at all. Typically, about 3/4 of an inch of water will be held by a foot of sandy soil. It's not going to hold it for an exceptionally long period, but it'll hold it for a day or so. And so you're not going to necessarily need to irrigate quite as much as you might think you need to. So what we're really trying to hit is this sweet spot between our field capacity and our permanent wilting point. And what field capacity is how much water any given segment of soil can hold on to before it begins to leach out nutrients and begins to pool water on top of it because it just can't hold anymore. We're trying to stay between that point at the top and the permanent wilting point at the bottom. Permanent wilting point means no matter how much water you put on that soil, those plants are not going to come back. They've reached the point where they have lost so much water that there is no recovery. So how do we tell that we're in that sweet spot right there? Well, you're going to want to rely on your plants very often to actually tell you that. You may notice in the summer, your vegetable plants are going to begin to wilt in the middle of the day, and that's just a byproduct of the heat of the day. That's a very normal process. You'll notice most of them do that. But if you notice that they're not bouncing back at night, may very well mean that you have too little moisture in your soil, and it might be time to irrigate. So your plants are going to dictate a lot of when your watering needs to happen, which is again why you need to be in your gardens every day, so that you get an idea of what your plants look like when they're healthy and what they look like when they need water or they need fertilizer, things like that. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. All of that is very dependent on your soil because soil is going to hold on to moisture at different rates. Mind your root zone when you are irrigating. I highly doubt that any of you have a tree in your gardens, but excuse me. But I like this graphic because it really drives home the point of your root zones can be at different depths. So if you have, say, this tree, you can see it's getting pretty deep roots in it, versus your herbaceous plants over here on the right have very shallow roots. The whole point of this graphic is to tell you you need to irrigate to that root zone. Anything that's not in that root zone is not being absorbed by that plant. Remember, the only tissues that can absorb nutrients and water are roots. Be wary of compacted soils. Compacted soils just don't let water infiltrate very well. If you're in a garden type situation, that's probably not going to be an issue. You really want to know how much irrigation your system is delivering. And the reason for that being, about 3/4 of an inch will saturate roughly 8 to 9 inches of soil. And so you probably don't need to water for 30 or 40 minutes at a time when it comes to your vegetable gardens, because that's going to get soaked very quickly. Your roots are really only growing in the top 12 inches of soil anyway. As you get deeper, it's going to get a little bit wetter and a little bit colder and a little bit moisture. So 3/4 of an inch is really going to provide a lot of water for you. Now, whether that's enough water for your plants or not, that's something that you're going to need to pay attention to your plants to figure out. But just keep in mind, a little bit of water can go a long way. I like this picture on the left because and these are turf grasses in the picture on the left, but it really drives home the point of irrigating properly and irrigating improperly. So the plants that are on the left are over irrigated. They've grown very shallow root systems because they don't need to do any work to get to that water, versus the plants on the right are properly irrigated. Now, which one of those do you think is going to do better in a drought? The deeper root system you can get, the better. So properly irrigating encourages root growth. Encouraged root growth, deeper roots, stronger roots are going to equate more drought tolerance. Not that that will be an issue, because you may not realize this, but you live in the rainiest part of Florida. We get more rain than Miami does. We get more rain than Tampa does. We get more rain than Jacksonville does. Actually, we really even get more rain than Tallahassee does. The 4 counties on the end of Florida specifically get roughly 68 inches of rain per year. Now, we do have a couple of dry months in there, like May, June-ish tends to be a little bit on the drier side, and around September it tends to be a little bit on the drier side. And sometimes we even get into droughty type situations in those 2 months. But you need to remember, keep an eye on the rain. If Mother Nature is going to water for you, you don't need to bother. On that front, it is actually a state statute that you have a rain sensor on your irrigation systems. This is not to say that the police are going to come by and they're going to give you a fancy new set of bracelets and haul you off if you don't have one. But if you were to say, put in for a permit to put a deck on your house and the inspector just happened to see you didn't have one, they'd probably say something to you. So it's a law, but it's not one of those ones that's going to be, they're not coming for you if you don't have it. Okay, scouting. Again, one of the reasons that you want to have your vegetable gardens close enough to your house that you're going to go out there and look at them every day. A couple of things that we look for when we're scouting. This picture on the left here is actually stink bug eggs, and that's going to be on the bottom side of the leaf. Excuse me. So make sure that when you're walking through your gardens, you're looking under the leaves, you're looking at the entire plant, not just taking a quick glimpse at it. All of your insect leaves are going to be on the bottom side of your leaf. Keep in mind, not every insect egg is going to be a bad insect. The vast majority of insects are actually beneficial. So you really do need to know what you're looking at, and you really do need to get very acquainted with the different insects that we have around here and figure out which ones are good and which ones are bad. Keep in mind that they can look different in the larval stage than they can in the adult stage. If you were to see a ladybug as a larva, you would probably think it was a bad insect and you would kill it, not realizing that it's going to eat the aphids and the mites and the other soft-bodied creatures that are in your gardens. So become very familiar with what we have here in the local environment. The other reason that we're going to go out and we're going to look in our gardens every day is right here on the right. We've got a nutrition deficiency here on the right. I believe that is a nitrogen deficiency. We call that intraveinochlorosis, and it's just a sign that our plants are giving us that we don't have enough nutrition in that soil. So you need to make sure that you're looking for those kinds of things. So we're going to talk about some specific things going on in our environment right now. Weeds being number one. Now, I know that none of you have any weed issues living here in Florida. We're lucky. We can grow vegetables year round, but we can also grow weeds year round. So right now, this picture here on the left is henbit, and that should be dying out right about now because the temperature is just getting too warm for it. But if you had been up north anywhere recently, and by up north, I mean up in Milton J area, you've probably seen fields of that stuff. I don't think you guys really get it too bad down there in the south end. But you'd see entire fields of henbit. And if your field's got kind of a pink hue to it, chances are it was henbit. On the other hand, chamber bitter, everybody has issues with that. The key to chamber bitter is do not shake it. When you pull them out, don't shake it. Let that little teaspoon of soil that's in the roots stay on it. The seeds of these, they grow on the bottom sides of the leaves. A lot of people will pull them and then they want that little bit of dirt, so they shake it. And what they wind up doing is spreading the seeds and creating a bigger problem for themselves. The whole point of this slide is so that you understand that your weeds are going to be an issue year round and you're going to need to treat for them accordingly. Okay. Thought I had these in a different order. Keep in mind that when you are looking at weeds, sometimes, much like I told you, the ladybug larva looks different than the ladybug adult. Sometimes the seedling for your weeds is going to look completely different to the adult plant. This is actually a morning glory that's on here. And if you've ever worked in a peanut field where these things have taken over and had to pull all this stuff out of a peanut field, you understand my hatred for this plant because I've had to do that. If you could have caught it at that seedling stage, it is very much so easier to remove. So again, you just need to be very familiar with the things in your environment and how they grow. So how do we prevent these weeds from ever happening in the first place? There's a couple of methods for it. What's going on in this picture right here is called solarization. They've essentially wrapped that soil in plastic and they're letting the sun hit that plastic. The sun is heating up the soil inside that plastic to a degree that nothing can live in it. So that's going to kill off a lot of the bad stuff that's going on in your soil. A lot of the weed seeds and things of that nature will die in that environment. Another way to do it is fumigation. Now, you're not going to be able to fumigate for weeds. You're going to have to hire somebody to come do this because it requires some specialty licensing and things of that nature. What they're going to do is they're going to bring a wand or a probe and they're going to stick it into the ground, and then they're going to turn on their machine and it's going to fumigate that soil. Those same pore spaces that were allowing air and all those other things to enter your root zone are now going to allow that fumigant to go through there. It's going to kill a lot of the weed seeds before they ever have a chance to grow. It's also going to kill all the good microbia that lives in there. But don't worry, a lot of the recent research is showing that that microbia comes back with a fierce passion after this fumigation event. So it's not a permanent disability to the microbia in there. The easiest way for you to prevent weeds in your garden areas is with a pre-emergent herbicide. Those you can buy, and a lot of times they're a granule and they're going to be a mass broadcast granule. Make sure that whatever you want growing in that garden is already growing before you apply these pre-emergent herbicides, or that you wait the label, whatever the label says is the waiting period after their application before they become ineffective, or not ineffective, but before they're out of the way and you can actually grow things in there. Make sure that you're timing with the plants that you want in your gardens with that. Otherwise, the pre-emergent doesn't see this is the plant I want versus this is the plant I don't want. And so it's just going to prevent all seeds from germinating. So just make sure that you're timing those things appropriately. Critical timing for weed control. You really need to control your weeds in the first 4 to 6 weeks of your garden. The reason for that, think of your garden as an ecology. All ecologies are a competition. So the plants that you want growing, you want to give them a leg up over the weeds. Once they start to grow and once they start to thrive and once they start to take over that area, they're actually going to shade a lot of the weeds out for you. Now, this isn't to say that you'll never get weeds in this little gardening system that he's got going on here. You'll probably get 1s and 2s and things like that, but the issue is going to be a lot less versus when your garden was at its early stage and those plants were, an inch tall. Now they're 6-7 inches tall and they're just going to dominate that environment. So just keep in mind that 4 to 6 weeks at the beginning of your gardening season is really when you want to make sure you're doing your weed control. Another thing that you can do is keep your existing soil covered. Now you can use mulches for that. You can use garden cloth. You can use a number of things to keep the soil covered so that the weed seeds don't have a chance to germinate. It's whatever falls into your moral spectrum to do, because some people spray, some people don't. So depending on what you feel is acceptable, go ahead and do that. Just make sure you don't have very much exposed soil. So how do people fail when it comes to weed prevention? The easiest way that people fail is called shallow cultivation. What that means is you're walking through your garden, you see a weed, you pick it up, you throw it out of your garden, and you say, ha, gotcha. Well, you left the roots to that plant still in the ground over there, and those roots are going to just produce another plant. When the ladies that work on my demo garden out here, they have these little 3-prong forks that they use, and they actually pop at the base of the plant and pull it out completely, roots and all, and they throw it in a bucket. Make sure you're cultivating the roots when you cultivate the weed as well. Otherwise, you're just going to keep having that problem. And post-emergent herbicide is another one, but the problem with these are people just like to pick one that they think is going to work, and they think it's going to work on every weed equally, which is just not true. We really need to identify what weed you have before we get into chemical controls for it and what's most effective for those chemical controls. If you don't know what it is, you can call us, you can send us pictures, and myself or my master gardeners will identify it for you and walk you through weed control, chemical controls for those weeds. Pathogens. This is something else, another reason you're going to want to be out there walking in your gardens every day to make sure that you're seeing what's going on. There's not a lot we can do for viruses. If you see a virus, you're going to need to do what we call roguing, which is you take that plant and you get it out of that garden system, and then you bag that up and you throw it away. Don't burn it, don't anything like that. Bag it and throw it away. The reason you want to do that, for viruses in particular, they actually have a tendency to make plants look very pretty, believe it or not. They'll make it look almost variegated with a lot of multicolored leaves and things of that nature. So some people go, hey, that looks really nice and I like it. And you know, it's not hurting anything. Okay, well, the production of that particular plant is declined because it has a virus. And so, yes, it's only that one plant at the moment until that little insect gets in there and sticks its hypodermic mouth part into that plant and then goes, oh, that one was so good, I want to go try this one over here. And it sticks its hypodermic mouth part into that plant. And now you're spreading that virus and you're reducing the production of your garden, which is not what we want to do. So go ahead and rogue that plant and get it out of there. It's the same thing with bacteria. We can't give plants antibiotics. It's not something that they can take. They can uptake. So again, we need to rogue that plant out of there. A lot of your bacterial issues it's going to come with heavy tissue damage, and you might get kind of an oozy type gross stuff going on with it. Go ahead and rogue that and get it out of there. Fungi, on the other hand, we can do quite a bit about. So fungi thrive in high moisture environments. And that's why here in Florida, we want to make sure that we're irrigating properly. We want to make sure that we don't have standing water in our gardens or on our lawns. We want to make sure that we prune our plants appropriately so that they're opened up a little bit. There is not a plant in Santa Rosa County that you shouldn't be able to see through. And I don't mean that there needs to be huge gaps between the leaves or anything like that, but you should be able to at least see the light on the other side of it. The reason for that being really closed in canopies have a tendency to retain moisture. High moisture environments breed fungus. So if we can prune those plants open a little bit, if we can keep air flowing through them, we can keep them a little bit drier, and we can remove any standing water and make sure that we're not adding too much water back into those systems. Insects. When it comes to insect damage, you really need to look at what the damage of the plant is. So on the picture on the right here, you see that there is a lot of missing tissue, a lot of chewed up parts. Well, it's from a bug that has chewing mouth parts. And so that's either going to be a caterpillar, which we have a saddleback caterpillar right here, or a grasshopper, a lubber, one of those types of things. Conversely, if you see that little leaf there on the bottom, if you're starting to see damage like that, you know that that's probably going to be a scale insect or an aphid or something that has a piercing, sucking mouth part that is sticking into the leaf and causing damage. The reason that we need to know what kind of damage is caused is because that's going to also dictate, much like I said with weeds, you want to make sure you know what the weed is so that you know the proper chemical to use to kill it. Same thing with bugs. If you have a chewing bug, then we're going to be able to work it out to kind of which one it is and help you figure out how to solve it. And now chemicals are not always the answer, and we're going to talk about that in a second. Versus scale, we'll know how to deal with that and those kinds of things. We need to know what the damage is so that we know how to treat the animal. These saddleback caterpillars, by the way, we do have those here in Santa Rosa County. If you see those, don't touch them. There's a reason that they look pretty. There's anything in nature that doesn't feel the need to hide, doesn't feel the need to hide for a reason. I had a master gardener a couple months ago touch one of those, and her arm doubled in size and turned red, and she had to go to the ER. So don't touch those. So how do we deal with all these things now that I've terrified you and made you not want to garden at all here in this county? Because there's so many things that can go wrong. How do we deal with all of these things? Well, we use a structure called integrative pest management to deal with all these things. It's a four-prong approach. We're going to go into each one individually, but it's a four-prong approach to keeping these things controlled so that you don't have issues. The first one is cultural controls. What we mean when we say cultural controls is we're going to make sure that we're keeping our plants stress-free. We're going to make sure that we're fertilizing properly. We're going to make sure that we're irrigating properly. We're reducing the stress on the plant that way. We're going to make sure that we're mulching appropriately. All of these things that you do to your garden, as far as setup is concerned and daily control and care is concerned, are cultural control. Those are eliminating excessive water, keeping that plant matter off of those gardens after they're done. So after your tomato gives you all the tomatoes you're going to get for the year, don't just leave that on the garden. Go ahead and cut it, throw it in your compost pile, let it compost properly. If you leave it on your gardens, there's a good chance that either a pathogen or an insect or something is going to use that to live through the winter, and then you're going to have that same problem next year. Get that stuff off your garden, get it away, get it composted. We also don't want excessively standing water. Again, we talked about that with the fungal stuff. The whole point of cultural controls is eliminating habitat for the things that you don't want in your garden. That's the whole point for it. Mechanical controls are next. Mechanical controls are nothing more than you pulled that weed up by the roots and all and got it out of your garden. Or in this case, you took this tomato hornworm off of this tomato and you threw it into a bucket of soapy water. Soapy water because it can't crawl back out. It's going to sit in there and it's going to die because insects breathe through their skin. And so you're going to get it in there and kill it that way because you don't want to crawl them back out of the bucket. But it is literally nothing more than you pulling those things off and killing them manually. Make sure, again, I've got to hammer this home, make sure that you are good enough with your insect ID that you know that the thing you're killing isn't a beneficial. You only want to kill the things that are going to be detrimental to your plant. You don't necessarily even want to kill their entire population. You want to kill that population back enough to where it's not causing you problems with your vegetables. Biological controls are by far the most fun, at least for biology nerds. This can be as easy as putting a birdhouse in your garden. Birds eat bugs. That's literally what we're talking about right here. There's also, birds are not the only thing that eats bugs. Some bugs eat bugs. And so if you can create habitat for some of those predatory insects or some of those parasitoids, you can actually control the insect issues that are going on in your gardens by using other insects. It's just the way nature works. It's an ecology like anything else. There may be some confusion here. A parasitoid is what's going on in this picture on the bottom left of the caterpillar. That's a wasp that has laid its babies on that caterpillar. Those babies will hatch and eat that caterpillar. Most of your parasitoids are going to be wasps. I have a rule with wasps at my house. If you're around my door or you're around my kids, I'm going to kill you. If you're out in the shed in a place that I don't go very often, or if you build your nest on the back of the house, that's fine, because you're probably taking care of my bad bugs for me. So as long as you're not in my face, I don't kill wasps. If they are in my face, that's when I kill them. What's going on in this other picture down here is actually a fungus that has taken over this ant. So you may not realize you can actually use some funguses, some bacteria, and some viruses for insect control. So what's going on with this ant, and we don't have this one here, so don't get scared. It's called a zombie fungus. What it does is it takes over that ant's brain, it makes it crawl to the top of a tree, stretch itself up as much as it can so that the wind can get to that fungus and spread that fungus. It's the reproductive process for that fungus. called a zombie fungus. We don't actually have that one here. The example of a bacteria that we do have here, if you've ever called my office and I've told you to spray BT on your caterpillars, well, BT is actually a bacteria. It's a Bacillus thuringiensis, I believe is the name of it. It's just a bacteria that affects caterpillars. You spray it, it kills the caterpillar. But it is a bacteria, it is a biological control. Chemical controls are an aspect of the IPM structure. We want you to completely exhaust the other three before we ever get to chemicals. The idea for chemicals is we want to spray them as little as possible, and we want to spray them as seldomly as we can. The reason for that being, let's say you have a tomato plant that's full of aphids. You go out there and you spray it with something that you know is going to kill aphids, and you kill off 98% of the population that's on that plant. Well, 2% of that population lived because they're resistant to that chemical, and they are now free to create a whole new population that's resistant to that chemical. The way we get around that is we minimize chemical use as much as humanly possible. We exhaust all these other methods before we get to this. That does not mean that chemicals are not a very viable way to do it. It just means that we want to minimize it as much as possible. And that is all that I have. So let me just go back through here and make sure that all the questions got answered real quick. I saw you guys were writing questions, which is good. What is a good service for testing the soil in your yard? Any recommendations? We can test pH here. We can facilitate sending it to University of Florida if you don't want to use the University of Florida. Waters Lab up in Georgia is pretty good. I think they're a little bit more expensive, but they're pretty good. You should be able to find them, just Waters, and then just make sure it's in Georgia. Otherwise, UF can do it, and so just call us and we'll facilitate that happen. Should manure be sterilized? He answered that one. Okay, looks like everything is answered. So a couple of resources here. You can go onto Google and you can Google, I have on here anything and then IFAS. If you Google the vegetable gardening guide, it's going to come up with basically this entire class I just taught you. This trick works for literally everything, including writing movie scripts and raising teenagers, because extension is a very broad spectrum now. IFAS means Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, and that's the people I work for. Everything UF has, literature-wise, is out there. Go ahead and go out there, read it. If you have any questions, give us a call. Couple of other resources. You can catch us on Twitter. You can catch us on Instagram. We have a Facebook page now too, which I need to put on here. It is UFIFAS, Santa Rosa County Master Gardeners. If you have not gotten onto that one yet, go ahead. I'll go ahead and put it in the chat here. That's our Facebook page right there. Go ahead and go out there and look at it. And all of my events are coming up or on there. I believe I'm doing pollinator gardens next month. So we're going to talk about bee mouths and bee tongues and how butterflies work and how hummingbirds work and that whole thing. I teach in the gardens, or not in the gardens. I teach in the libraries every month a different subject. So just make sure you're paying attention. All of those will be on that Facebook page. But that is all that I have. I'll stick on here for a few minutes. If any of you would like to talk to me, then I will stay on here for a few minutes. Other than that, I'm finished.
Josh, I have a question for you. I have a couple grapevines that I'm growing, and in the middle of some of the leaves, I've got holes in them now.
You've got holes in them. Okay. That sounds like an insect issue. That would be a chewing insect, probably a caterpillar.
Caterpillar, you think? Okay.
Of some kind. Yeah. If you can bring some into us, we can take a look at them.
Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your class. I enjoyed it.
Oh, good. Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
It was a great class. I'm in the process of moving from the Lake Tahoe area. This is quite an eye-opener.
Oh.
We don't have to grow anything on granite.
Yeah. Well, so we're just kind of a strange environment down here, but you'll get used to it. I actually used to live up in Sacramento, so I kind of know what you're talking about.
Yeah, I live 14 miles from Incline Village on Mount Rose, so you probably know that area. But
A
we
little
bought a
bit.
house.
I used to be a whitewater guide up there on the American River
Oh, yeah,
on the
yeah.
South Fork.
Yeah, I've done that whitewater trip.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's pretty
Yeah, it's
amazing.
fun.
Yeah, but it's very different down here. So I'm just trying to get used to the thunder and lightning.
Yeah. Well, we're a good resource for you. We're completely free. You're welcome to come in here. We spent 2 hours with a couple this morning talking about long grass. So we don't have any problem sitting down and answering every one of your questions.
Well, that's great because this house we bought has more weeds than grass. So,
That's a
gonna
fairly
have to-
common problem here, but we can help you work. We can help you work through that.
okay, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
When will we know your next class?
I will probably be advertising those tomorrow. I put them out on that Facebook page, and I also put them out through the county's public information office.
Oh, can you
Um,
tell me that Facebook page again? I missed that.
oh, sure. It's UFIFAS,
UF,
UF as in University of Florida,
okay,
and then IFAS, just like I told you to put into the Google,
okay.
and then Santa Rosa County Master Gardeners.
Thank you.
You're welcome. What city do you live in? What town do you live in? Or which library would you go to? I guess I should ask.
I live closest to Gulf Breeze, Florida Library.
Okay, Go Freeze is gonna be the second Monday of the month, I believe,
Okay,
at 10:30 in the morning. I'm sorry, 2:30 in the afternoon. I'll be there.
okay. And then any more on what we have now on Zoom? I care for my mother. She has dementia, so I'm not able at this point to get out a whole lot.
Okay, yeah,
want-
so the Zoom is gonna be probably the last Thursday of the month.
Last Thursday of the month, okay?
Yeah, I teach
Then
it the
you-
day after I teach in PACE.
Oh, I see it. Well, you'll send an advertisement like before?
Yeah, it'll pop up in the events section of that Facebook page as well.
Okay. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, if nobody else has anything, I'm gonna go ahead and sign off. If I can remember where to do that.